Hello everyone, my name is Salar and you're watching Smart Code. Now I'm here with another interesting tutorial on JavaScript. We will program a basic calculator from the beginning using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. We will read data from the text boxes, and for choosing operators, we will use radio buttons. One radio button for each operator like addition, subtraction, multiplication and division, right? And we will also validate data in our text boxes. Like you can't leave any text box empty. If you do so, our application will show an error message, right? And as you see, the appearance of our application is average. And this is because of I'm not putting so much focus on CSS. It's a JavaScript tutorial, so we will put focus on JavaScript and obviously on HTML. You will learn how to write HTML for JavaScript. Right, so without any further ado, let's start coding this application. Now in my VS Code editor, I have already put three files: index.html for HTML, style.css for CSS, and calc.js for JavaScript. So let's start with the HTML and prepare a document for JavaScript. Take a container for the whole program. After the program heading, we will code our first input text box. Right, so this is our first text box. Input type is text and it has an ID number 1. And using this ID, we will read text box value in the JavaScript. And just after the text box, we have a span tag. Span tag has an ID error number 1 and it will be used to show error related to the number 1. And the text in the span is just an asterisk. If you check this HTML in the browser, it will look like this. And now we will code another input box. So I just need to copy and paste this code. And we'll change the name of classes and IDs accordingly. And now you will see two check boxes, one for number 1 and one for number 2, right? And now we will code radio buttons for operators. And here you need to be careful about a couple of things. So let me first code radio buttons for operators, and then I will tell you what you need to be careful of. We coded 4 radio buttons for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, right? Now the first important thing here is name attribute. You will give the same name to all the radio buttons. And by doing so, you are actually defining a group of radio buttons. And once you have radio group, you can only select one radio button at a time. And this is what we want, right? And the second important thing is their ID attributes. And we will fetch them in JavaScript at once using this ID. And each radio button will differentiate itself by its value attribute. As you see, the value is different for each radio button. And you will set any one radio button to checked. So the radio button for plus operator is checked by default. And it makes addition or default operation. Now, if you run your application, you will see addition radio button is checked by default. And you can simply select any other one just by clicking on it, right? So now we are going to put a button in the program. Right, so we have a button with an ID, calc button. And now we just need a paragraph to print the result. So now we have our HTML ready for JavaScript. Every HTML element that we need in JavaScript has been assigned an ID. And this is how we code HTML for JavaScript. Now we'll put some CSS and style our application. So let's link CSS file to the program. So the CSS file is included, and now we will write some very basic CSS. I will first target the program main container and give it a width, background color, and text color. And this is how it looks in the browser at this stage. And now I will target all the divs inside the program container and give them bottom and left margin. So let's target all the divs. Set bottom margins to 25 pixels and left margin to 20 pixels. Right, so now we have some good space between the elements. And now we are going to put program title and the button to the center of the container, and we will also increase the font size of program title, right? So let's first target the heading, align it to the center, and increase the font size to 2em. Now target the button, and align it also to the center of the container. So now the program title and the button is center aligned. And now we will change the text color of the span tags to the red, right? So let's first target the span tag and set text color to red, right? And now it looks good. Now if you want to have your application to the center of the page, you just need to apply flex to the body and set the justify content property to center. So let's apply flex to the body element. Target the body and apply flex and set justify content to center. That's it. And now you will see your application is center aligned. So no more CSS. Let's now program JavaScript and finalize this application. So I'm closing the CSS file, and we already have a JavaScript file in our editor, which is calc.js. We will first include this file into our HTML document, and we will include it here right before the closing of main container. So JavaScript file is included. Let's now open calc.js file and start writing JavaScript. Let's look at the philosophy of this application before we start writing JavaScript. Everything is programmed behind this button. JavaScript will only execute when you click on this button. So our first step should be to make this button available for JavaScript. And once the button is available for JavaScript, then we are going to attach a click event to it. So the first step should always be fetch button element into the JavaScript. And for that we use JavaScript's getElementById method. Now JavaScript has button element in the program. CalcBtn is the ID of the button in the HTML. Now we are going to attach click event to the button. And for that we use add event listener method. So let's code it. Now using this method, JavaScript is gonna listen for every click you make on this button, right? And whenever you make a click, a user defined function which is do calculation is called. Now we just need to define this function, and we are going to program entire calculation in this function. So let's define it. So now you have better idea how things are working here. Whenever you make a click, this function is called. And here is the definition of this function. Now, in order to find out everything is working fine up till now, you can simply write an alert message in the function. And if you see the alert message in the browser, that means connectivity is fine. So just refresh your page and click on the calculate. And here you see the alert message. That means JavaScript is listening for click events and calling the function. Now we will read values from the text boxes, and at the same time we will convert them to numbers. So now we have user input in the program, and we also need span tags in the program before we perform data validation, because we are using span tags for showing the errors, right? So let's first get span tag in the program. So by using span tags IDs, we are getting them in the program. Now this parse float method converts string representation of numbers into floating point numbers. And if the conversion goes wrong, it returns a NaN value. So we will use this NaN value to determine whether the user input is good or not. And if you are unsure how number conversions work and how do we deal with isNaN value and isNaN function, then I would recommend my JavaScript tutorials number 13 and 14, right? So we will first validate data coming from the first text box, and we also need a boolean variable to keep track of the validation process. So we have a boolean variable set to true, and whenever validation goes wrong, we will set it to false. So let's validate first text box. Right, so if the value in the variable number 1 is NaN, we will set span inner text to wrong value, and is valid is set to false. And if the value is fine, we will set inner text back to asterisk, right? So let's check it out and see if the validation in the first text box is working or not. We need to refresh the page and just leave this text box empty and click on the calculate button. And here you see a wrong value message on the screen. And if I write something that can be converted into the numbers, you won't see any error message, right? So the data validation in our first text box is working, and now we are going to validate data in our second text box. So I will just copy and paste this code again and make it work for the second text box. Right, so now the data is validated in our text boxes, and we have a boolean variable which is keeping track of validation process, right? And we will use this boolean variable when we perform final calculation. Now we just need to find out which operation is selected by the user. We have 4 radio buttons and one can be selected at a time. So we will first get all the radio buttons in the program using query selector all method, and then we will find out which one is selected, right? So let's first get radio buttons in the program. So this query selector all method will get all the elements which have been assigned this ID. Now if you look back to our HTML, so you will see all the radio buttons have the same ID, and that means query selector all will get all of them, right? And it returns a collection. So this variable is actually a node list, or you can simply call it an array of nodes or an array of radio buttons, right? So you can just loop through this operations variable, which is actually a list, to find out which radio button is checked. And it's very easy to program using the for loop. So we first need a variable for holding the operation value, and now we will loop through the operation list to find out which radio button is checked. If any radio button is checked, we read its value attribute into this variable. And value is different for each radio button, like you see in the HTML, right? So now we have validated numbers and choose an operator. And our final step should be to perform calculation using numbers and operator. And when I perform calculation, I will use my isValid operator. I would say if is valid. Okay, this statement is important. If you look at the program flow, we set is valid to true in the beginning, right? And if something wrong happens with number 1 and number 2, we set is valid to false. And that means with false value, you will never come inside this if block, right? And our program will perform calculation only when this variable is true. Now, in order to perform calculation, we have two options here. We can either use if else if statements or switch case. I will use switch case because switch case is a better option to solve problem like this. So let's now code the final version. We need a variable for holding the result. And now we will code switch with 4 different cases, one case for each operator. Right, so the calculation part is done and we will now print the result. And if you check our HTML, so we will use this paragraph for publishing the result. So we will first get this paragraph into the JavaScript and then place result into it. So in the JavaScript file, we will write something like this. So now our application is finalized. And instead of using template string, you can also use a string concatenation. So let's now give our program a final run. So if you try to calculate without providing any input, our program will show error message. So let's provide some input and check for all the operations. Addition working, subtraction working, multiplication working, and division working. So this is how you will code a basic calculator using HTML and JavaScript. I hope you like this tutorial and please do tell me how it was just by writing comments under this video. I will see you around and thanks for watching.